In this video, I'm going to be focusing on one of the more tedious aspects of building a scale model of a ship. That is the preparation of the many small components that go on the deck. If you have never built a 1 in 350 scale battleship and you are considering building one, this is one of those aspects to be aware of. It's not exactly the most enjoyable part of building a ship, but it does need to be done. I do realize that that's not the greatest advert for a video. In this video, I'll be doing something that is boring and tedious. Please watch. But nevertheless, my goal for this build series is to show as much of the construction of the ship as possible. So in this video, I'll be preparing the majority of the components that are installed on the forecastle deck. I'll not install the flagstaff at this stage. Installing something that's tall and thin at the point of the bow is just going to get knocked off and damaged, so there's really no point in installing that now. It'll just be a problem. The HMS Hood Association suggests a correction for parts F45 and F46, the anchor capstans. They say that they have been molded upside down, or at least one of their readers says it has been molded upside down. When I look at these parts, I partially disagree with them. Part 45 is definitely molded the correct way around, and that will be installed as is. Part F46 is where I agree that there is a problem. It's not so much that it is upside down, rather that the detailing on the top is incorrect. It does look as though the detailing on the top would be more appropriate for the underside, but since that is going to be concealed by the anchor chain, I'm more concerned about the detailing on the top. The best thing that I can do to improve the accuracy of the detailing on the top is in fact just to remove all the detailing and make the top flat. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to file off the detailed structure on the top of part F46 and leave part F45 as is. Other than that, there are no other corrections for this work that I'm going to be embarking on. When it comes to photo-etched replacement parts, there are only two things that need to be replaced, and those are the cranes and the cable spools. The cranes are replaced with very delicate photo-etched structures, so I'm not going to be installing those at this time, for the same reason that I'm not going to install the flagstaff at the bow at this time. However, I will be constructing the photo-etched cable spools, which is quite a tedious process. To prepare all these small components, it's not a tricky process, it's more of a logistics process. It's making sure that what you cut off you can keep track of. Essentially, that just means clipping all the parts off and keeping them together so that you're able to identify which part is which. For the most part, that isn't a problem because these parts are distinctly different looking, and well, if you compare them to the part on the manual, it's quite easy to see which one goes where. However, that does become a little bit more tricky when you're dealing with these circular vents. Circular vents have a tendency to look quite similar, so it's only really the number that distinguishes them. To ensure that I don't mix up these circular vents, after I've cut them off, I stick them to masking tape with the part number written on the tape. After removing all the parts, I then further clip down the excess using side cutters, after which I use a fine file to smooth off the edge and to remove the excess flashing. There is a fair bit of flashing on these small parts, which does make it quite awkward to work with them. It's very difficult to hold them since they are so small, but I just have to make do with what I have, get them as clean as I can possibly make them. This is part F46, the anchor capstan that I said needs to have the detail on its top removed. So I just remove it using a file. After all the components have been cut and filed and are cleaned up nicely, I then place them on an ice cream tub lid that is covered in masking tape so that they are ready for paint. In the previous videos, you saw me construct the wave brakes and the anchors. In their videos, I didn't paint them, so I'm going to be painting them now along with all of the other components that will be installed at the same time. There is another sheet of Photo-etched that I'm going to be installing, and that is this very small sheet from Pontos that came with the wooden deck. This improves the detailing of the hatches on the forecastle deck. These parts also need to be painted before installation, so they will also be painted at the same time. The last component to paint are the cable spools. From my experience, photo-etched cable spools never come in a detail kit with the barrel supplied. You always have to make one yourself out of wire or plastic tubing. I really wish that they did provide barrels with the cable spools, because then you wouldn't have to worry about cutting your own barrels to the correct length, which is quite a tedious and difficult process to do. If I didn't have to do that, it would make this so much more enjoyable. But nevertheless, I will have to do it myself. So after folding the cable spools into the correct position, I use brass wire to cut out a little barrel that I can glue in place with super glue, which at a later stage I can wrap wire around. After a bit of trial and error, cutting off sections of wire, I find a length that I'm happy with, and then I build that jig using a piece of metal that I've glued together with super glue to stick down a whole lot of pieces of wire at once and then file them all to the same length. Once that is done, I have 14 pieces of wire for these 14 barrels, of which I only need 12, and then proceed to stick the barrels in place using extra thick super glue, which I apply to both edges of the barrel before inserting it into the cable spool. This is a very tedious process, and it's very easy for the barrel to be either slightly too long or slightly too short, which then means the sides of the cable spool don't stand up vertically, and then the whole thing looks odd. It's also quite difficult to make sure that it's properly centered, and these parts aren't very big, which makes this all a little bit more complicated to deal with. I never enjoy working with cable spools. I find it to be a bit of a chore when building a ship, but nevertheless it is something that needs to be done. I've tried many ways of doing this. You can try winding the wire or string onto a spool first and then cutting it, but then the problem is that it's difficult to cut everything to the right length, and you often will pinch the wire, which means its shape is wrong. It's difficult to cut through it, so I find that the best thing to do is to install a barrel without any wire in it first, and then wrap the wire around at a later stage. For the larger cable spools, I need a larger diameter because I only want to wrap one round of wire around this to get that effect of cable on the spool. And having a larger diameter cord just means I only need to put on one level. I don't need to wrap it around multiple times to build up to the correct thickness. In this case, I'm using polystyrene tube. Once again, the same process is followed. I cut a piece off, I then file it down until I get it to the correct length. I then use that piece as a reference and cut off and file down the remaining required pieces. In this case, there are only 4 of these cable spools, so I don't bother to build the jig, I just do it by hand. The installation of these larger diameter barrels is exactly the same for the smaller cable spools. Put super glue on both ends of the barrel and then insert it into the cable spool. With the cable spools partly constructed, I'm now ready to paint them, and this is because I'm not going to be painting the wire that I put onto the cable spool. The wire should be a metallic gray, and I'm going to be using lead wire to represent the cable on the spool, which is already the correct color, so I don't need to paint it. This means that everything can now be painted. I'm using XF53, this is the color that I'm using for the hull and superstructure of hood. After giving the paint a bit of time to dry, I can now begin the long and tedious process of wrapping lead wire around the cable spools. I use lead wire because it's very soft and malleable. It's very easy to put it on and keep it in place. It doesn't want to jump off all of the time. And in this case, it also has the advantage of being the correct color. The problem with lead wire is that it is very delicate, and if you pull too hard, it will snap. For these spools, I'm using fairly thick lead wire. This is 0.4mm, which is definitely out of scale. But if I were to drop it down to 0.2mm, it would require a lot more rounds to be wrapped around the barrel, and that wire is significantly more delicate, which means that with multiple turns around the barrel, it becomes weaker every time you bend it, and it's far more likely to snap. That then pushes it into the next level of complexity, and I barely have enough patience to do it with 0.4mm wire, so I accept that it is going to be out of scale, but it is good enough to represent that there is a cable on the spool. In the past, I have attempted to represent cable with various types of thread, and I find it just to be worse. It always wants to jump off of the spool. You're continuously trying to clog it down and glue it in place with super glue. It's also just a mess. And if you have the wrong type of cable, then it gets all frizzy and horrible. I just don't like it. Another option would be to use fishing line, but once again, it's difficult to work with that because it has a tendency to want to spring away, so you need to use glue to hold it down all the time. With lead wire, apart from it being a bit delicate, you don't even need glue to hold it in place. Where you put it, it stays, and that is very welcome when trying to deal with something delicate and small like this. Fortunately, I did manage to construct 12 acceptable small cable spools and 4 acceptable large cable spools. In the next video, I get to go through the far more enjoyable process of installing all of these components onto the ship. If you would like to support this channel or see how the ship looks when it is completed, then please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers.